Look at the headlines screaming from your screens right now. Carbon taxes, plummeting birth rates, bans on gas stoves, billionaires in Davos casually debating the controlled degrowth of your living standards. Now, watch the high-definition panic glitch and collapse backward. Behind the modern crisis is a stream of primitive, glowing green computer code. The terrifying reality you navigate daily was pre-rendered 50 years ago on a machine with less memory than a modern greeting card. You are bleeding capital and you think it is just bad luck. Record inflation, exorbitant energy bills, and that heavy, paralyzing psychological burden of climate guilt are not accidental. They are not an organic reaction to a changing natural world. If you do not understand the origin of these top-down policies, you are blindly playing a game where the rules were mathematically rigged against your prosperity before you were even born. Your ignorance is a devastating tax you pay every single day. But the official narrative is a myth, and statistics lie when the initial parameters are poisoned. We are going to decode the World 3 algorithm, the true patient zero of modern global anxiety. Through the lens of forensic data science, I will show you how to read the hidden socioeconomic matrix. We will dismantle the archaic math that terrifies the world, giving you the intellectual armor to predict the exact next moves of global policymakers. The red pill is in the historical data. The fluorescent lights of a pristine modern supermarket hum above you. You stare at the price of a simple carton of eggs, feeling the quiet sting of engineered scarcity. Right outside the sliding glass doors, a giant digital billboard pulses with a ticking climate doomsday clock, counting down to an apocalyptic deadline. But as we pull back, the physical walls dissolve. The aisles, the eggs, the clock, they all become suspended inside a cold, wireframe, three-dimensional grid of a simulation. You are standing inside a crime scene, disguised as a functioning economy. Look at the flow of global capital. Today, the world economy is increasingly governed by environmental, social, and governance scores, a nebulous metric dictating exactly who gets funding and who goes bankrupt. Trillions of dollars pivot on these arbitrary environmental limits. It is a financial chokehold, starving industries of investment based on an invisible, universally accepted consensus of impending doom. Move from the abstract ledgers to the literal soil. Governments worldwide are brutally implementing sudden policies to restrict nitrogen fertilizers. You see the massive, desperate farmer protests erupting from the highways of the Netherlands to the collapsing streets of Sri Lanka. These mandates are systematically reducing global agricultural output by up to 30% in affected regions. We are intentionally engineering mass crop failures under the guise of ecological salvation. Your high school textbooks and the nightly news anchors tell you a comforting lie. They claim this is a sudden 21st century awakening to ecological reality. They insist our leaders simply looked at the modern thermometer and panicked. This is a profound misconception. What you are witnessing is not a spontaneous reaction to a dying planet. It is the exact, methodical execution of a 50-year-old script. The policies choking you today were hard-coded into existence decades ago. Consider the absolute paradox of our era era. We possess unprecedented technological supremacy. We can split the atom, sequence the human genome in hours, and launch reusable rockets into orbit. Yet, our economic and social policies are aggressively regressive, demanding less energy, less food, and fewer people. Why would a hyper-advanced civilization voluntarily place itself in a medieval straitjacket? The answer is not found in the melting ice caps, but in a buried data anomaly. Every anomaly you notice, the artificial capping of energy grids, the systematic demonization of basic human reproduction, the sudden unbanking of dissenting industries, shares a single, identical genetic fingerprint. To a forensic data analyst, these are not isolated geopolitical blunders. They are outputs of the same underlying function. We are living inside the terminal phase of a sociological experiment, reacting to a digital phantom that escaped its mainframe half a century ago. You were programmed to accept this managed decline as an unavoidable scientific law. The genius of this operation is that it does not require an active conspiracy or a smoky room of villains pulling levers today. It only required the insertion of a fundamentally flawed premise into the bedrock of global academia and elite policymaking decades ago. Once the bad code was accepted as undisputed truth, the system simply automated the destruction of its own potential without further human input. To find the original architects of this modern, suffocating scarcity, we must abandon the noise of the present. We have to strip away the glossy climate summits and the complex international treaties. We must travel back to an era before the internet, before personal computers existed in every home. Our investigation points directly to a secretive, high-level meeting in Italy, a gathering where the limitless potential of the human future was mathematically assassinated by an elite consensus. The evidence trail leads away from the natural world and straight into the cold, unforgiving logic of mid-20th century computing. We are chasing a ghost in the machine, a foundational error that infected the minds of the people who run the world. The grand paradox is that the most terrifying threats facing humanity today were entirely synthesized. The panic was manufactured, quantified, and packaged for elite consumption long before you ever took your first breath. Which brings us to the ultimate illusion of the present moment. You look around and see a chaotic world buckling under the weight of spontaneous environmental and economic disasters. But the deeper you dig into the archives, the more predictable the chaos becomes. The numbers align too perfectly. The engineered starvation and forced energy limits are too perfectly synchronized. Why does every global crisis today sound exactly like the output of a mathematical equation? That mathematical equation, the one actively suffocating your daily life, was not born in a modern climate laboratory. I found its true origin perfectly preserved in the archives, hiding behind the Renaissance frescoes of the Villa Farnesina in Rome, Italy. The year is 1968. The air is thick with heavy cigar smoke. We are stepping into the exact location where the intellectual weapon of artificial scarcity was first forged. You were taught that historical turning points look like battlefields or grand public treaties. You were wrong. The real tipping points happen in quiet, opulent rooms where a few dozen people decide the fate of billions. Through the lens of an archivist, the scene is a chilling paradox. You see industrialists and scientists, the very beneficiaries of human progress, gathered around a heavy oak table, drafting a handwritten manifesto of global limits. This is the gathering of the self-appointed saviors. I want you to confront a deeply uncomfortable paradox. What exactly happens when the richest, most powerful men on Earth collectively decide there are simply too many people? They do not see themselves as villains. They look at the booming middle class, the rising life expectancies, the spread of cheap energy, and they do not see a triumph. They see a terrifying threat to their own equilibrium. In April 1968, an Italian industrialist named Aurelio Pace and a Scottish scientist named Alexander King orchestrated this quiet summit. They gathered 30 European scientists, elite economists, and influential business leaders. Together, this microscopic fraction of the global population formed an exclusive, shadow intellectual syndicate. They called themselves the Club of Rome, and they were about to rewrite the rules of your reality. Think about the sheer, arrogant mathematics of this room. 30 unelected individuals sat down to diagnose a planet of roughly 3.5 billion people. They looked at the post-war industrial boom, the concrete poured, the highways built, and the families expanding. To the forensic investigator, their resulting documentation reads less like a scientific inquiry and more like a psychological projection of absolute elite panic. Their foundational belief system was crystallized into a concept they ominously called the problématique. This was not a nuanced view of resource management. They genuinely believed humanity was a literal cancer on the earth, multiplying too fast and consuming entirely too much. You have been programmed to believe that modern environmentalism was a grassroots rebellion. The archive proves it was actually a top-down containment strategy. But here is the fatal flaw in their master plan. You cannot simply walk up to a sovereign nation and demand they shut down their factories. You cannot tell a working-class family to stop having children just because a group of philosophers in an Italian villa feel claustrophobic. Philosophical arguments, no matter how elegantly phrased over fine wine, were never going to be enough to fundamentally alter global economic policy. The elites in the Club of Rome understood a core principle of human psychology. People will instinctively rebel against authoritarian decrees. If they wanted to successfully restrict the energy and expansion of everyday citizens without sparking a global revolution, they needed a disguise. They needed to present their ideological panic as an unavoidable law of nature. They needed an alibi that the public would be too intimidated to question. To convince sovereign governments to voluntarily restrict their own citizens, they required something entirely infallible. They needed the ultimate, unquestionable authority of the late 20th century. They needed a computer. In 1968, a mainframe was not just a machine, it was an oracle. If a complex network of wires and punch cards produced a result, the average person accepted it as objective, mathematically pure truth. This is the brilliant, insidious hack at the center of the archive. You argue with politicians, you protest against industrialists, but you do not argue with a supercomputer. The Club of Rome realized that if they could feed their extreme biases into a digital black box, the output would no longer be viewed as an elitist opinion. It would be worshipped as hard, indisputable science. It was the perfect laundering mechanism for their ideology. So, they outsourced the apocalypse. They did not have the technical capacity to build this digital doomsday machine themselves. They needed the most prestigious, intimidating intellectual fortress they could find. They looked across the Atlantic Ocean, past the politicians in Washington, and aimed directly at the humming, sterile laboratories of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They were shopping for an architect of decline. I traced the paper trail from the opulent frescoes of Rome straight into the dusty, fluorescent-lit sub-basements of MIT. Here, surrounded by stacks of yellowed punch cards and magnetic tape, the real crime was committed. The Club of Rome specifically targeted a pioneer of early computer modeling. They sought out an engineer who viewed the entire spectrum of human emotion, ambition, and struggle as nothing more than raw, manipulatable data. They found a man who confidently claimed he could translate the chaotic, unpredictable magic of human civilization into rigid lines of code. He promised them he could simulate the entire world,
The elites finally had their weapon. They were about to fund a digital terrarium, a rigged mathematical game that would dictate the limits of your life, your energy, and your future, half a century before you were even born.
I walk into the humming, sterile chill of an MIT computer lab archive. It is 1970. The philosophical panic of the European elite has crossed the ocean and materialized into something heavy, loud, and metallic. Massive IBM mainframes dominate the room, their magnetic tape drives spinning with hypnotic precision. This is where the subjective fear of 30 billionaires was transmuted into objective, undeniable mathematics. An engineer in a short-sleeve button-down feeds a thick stack of stiff cardboard punch cards into a mechanical reader. Click, clack, whir. You can hear the physical weight of the data being digested by the machine. The Club of Rome arrived here holding a vague, Malthusian dread about the future. Mitt handed them back a loaded weapon. But how do you actually encode the destiny of a species into a machine that possesses less memory than your digital wristwatch? You were taught that supercomputers process infinite complexity. That is a myth. The paradox of the 20th century is that ultimate power requires ultimate simplification. To the archivist standing in this room, the anomaly is glaring. How do you cram the chaotic, brilliant, unpredictable lives of 4 billion human beings into a digital black box containing merely 200 kilobytes of memory? You do not. You mutilate reality until it fits the code. The architect of this digital mutilation was J. Forrester. He was not an ecologist nor an economist. He was a pure electrical engineer, the literal inventor of magnetic core memory. To Forrester, the world was not a vibrant ecosystem of free will. It was just a massive motherboard. He founded a discipline known as systems dynamics, operating on a brutally arrogant premise. Human civilization is nothing but a series of mechanical feedback loops. I pull a faded schematic from the archive box. It looks like a wiring diagram, but it maps human existence. Forrester believed that if you tweak one input, the entire global society reacts predictably. He built the original framework, a model he called World One. It was a sterile, deterministic view of biology and economics. But to the Club of Rome, it was exactly the totalitarian oracle they had been searching for. The project was handed down to his protege, Dennis Meadows, who expanded this digital framework into the infamous World 3 algorithm. You must understand the sheer arrogance of this moment. A handful of men in a fluorescent-lit basement decided they could predict the exact date of your economic ruin. They believed they had captured the ghost of humanity within the machine. But what exactly was the machine processing? To the modern forensic analyst, the codebase of World 3 looks like a child's toy. It was written in DYNAMO, an incredibly primitive early-stage simulation language. It lacked the nuance to calculate even the weather patterns of a single city, let alone the geopolitical shifts of the entire globe. Yet, this clunky script was loaded onto an IBM 360 mainframe, the absolute pinnacle of computing power at the time. The blinking console of the IBM 360 projected an aura of absolute authority. The researchers wore white coats. The printouts came on endless reams of perforated paper. It was a theatrical performance of science. When the machine spat out a graph, the politicians did not see the flawed human logic programmed into the DYNAMO language. They saw the voice of an artificial god, rendering a final, unappealable verdict on our species.
Your high school textbooks tell you that early climate models were marvels of objective data collection. This is a profound misconception. A computer model is only as intelligent as the assumptions typed into the terminal. And the assumptions fed into this specific mainframe were severely, purposefully handicapped. The code did not simulate real, adaptable humans. It simulated mindless, consuming algorithms operating on autopilot. I review the original punch cards. The true horror of World 3 lies in its brutal simplicity. Out of the infinite complexity of life, the model tracked only 5 strict variables: global population, agricultural production, natural resources, industrial output, and pollution. That is it. All of art, culture, technological breakthroughs, and human resilience were entirely erased from the mathematical equation. The system was completely deaf to human genius. If population goes up, resources go down, and pollution goes up. It was a closed loop of despair. To the archivist tracing these variables, the fraud is completely obvious. This was not a mirror reflecting the real dynamic Earth. It was a digital terrarium. And inside this terrarium, the rules were artificially fixed to guarantee that the organisms would eventually suffocate. You are living in the direct fallout of this exact terrarium today. When modern bureaucrats talk about your carbon footprint or the absolute need to halt industrial output, they are reciting the DYNAMO code verbatim. They are treating you not as a problem-solving citizen, but as a destructive variable that must be mathematically minimized. The code explicitly programmed humanity as a fatal virus infecting the global motherboard. This was the ultimate scientific sleight of hand. The Club of Rome paid for a simulation that would mathematically validate their pre-existing fear of the masses. And MIT delivered the product. They created a closed system where survival was statistically impossible. But as we dig deeper into the actual mathematics of World 3, a specific anomaly emerges. A deliberate, hard-coded flaw that rigged the game against you from the very first line. This hard-coded flaw did not remain buried in an obscure MIT sub-basement. It was packaged, printed, and unleashed upon an unsuspecting public. In 1972, the research team published their findings under a title designed to end all debate: The Limits to Growth. The global elite finally had their scientifically validated weapon, and the masses consumed it without hesitation. Through the eyes of the macroeconomic forensic analyst, this book is not a scientific treatise. It is the most successful psychological operation of the 20th century. The Limits to Growth sold over 30 million copies across 30 distinct languages. It became an absolute scientific blockbuster, transforming a deeply flawed computer program into the undisputed gospel of modern environmentalism. Look at the sharp, high-contrast animation of the original World 3 output graphs. 5 colored lines crawl across a black grid, representing the entirety of human existence. In the standard run of the model, the timeline is terrifyingly clear. The simulation showed that global society would suffer a catastrophic, irreversible collapse precisely by the mid-21st century. The mathematical heart monitor of civilization flatlines before your very eyes. The line representing natural resources plummets vertically into the abyss. Immediately after, the lines for human population and food production crash violently. The machine predicted that your future would be defined by mass starvation and the total depletion of the Earth's life support systems. You were programmed to look at these plunging graphs and feel a profound sense of guilt. The official narrative demands you accept this collapse as the inevitable punishment for human greed. But the statistics lie. As a forensic analyst dissecting the code, I look for the anomaly. I look for the exact line of programming where the architects of this model committed mathematical perjury. Here is the forensic glitch, the deliberate sleight of hand hidden deep within the DYNAMO code. The entire apocalyptic prediction hinges on one counterintuitive assumption. The model strictly dictated that human consumption would grow exponentially, multiplying year after year like a virus. But the very same code locked human innovation into a slow, crawling, purely linear progression.
This is a spectacular foundational paradox. If you build a digital universe where consumption multiplies geometrically, but the ability to solve problems only inches forward one step at a time, you mathematically guarantee an apocalypse. The machine did not discover a natural limit to human survival. It simply executed the rigged equation it was explicitly ordered to run.
The code was fundamentally arrogant. It assumed that we would never invent new revolutionary ways to extract energy. It programmed a hard, impenetrable ceiling on our ability to increase crop yields, entirely ignoring the looming agricultural revolutions. It assumed humans would never substitute heavy, scarce materials with light, synthetic alternatives. The game was entirely rigged.
What you are looking at on this black, glowing grid is not a futuristic prophecy of the 21st century. It is simply the digitization of the 18th century Malthusian trap. Thomas Malthus wrongly predicted that population would outstrip food supply in 1798. The MIT scientists merely took a disproven 200-year-old economic fallacy and dressed it up in computer code. They successfully convinced you that a static algorithm could accurately predict the chaotic, brilliant, unpredictable spark of human genius. But an algorithm cannot simulate a paradigm shift. It cannot predict a mind that has not yet been born. By deliberately blinding the machine to our capacity for exponential innovation, they created a phantom menace that dictates your life today. The entire architecture of modern global anxiety is built upon this single, hard-coded, statistical lie. If you want to keep seeing the hidden code behind the headlines, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments which global policy you think is a simulation glitch. If this scale of deception blows your mind, hit the like button. We are dismantling their matrix one variable at a time. To the macroeconomic forensic analyst, the true crime is not that the model was wrong. The crime is that it was adopted as infallible truth by the geopolitical elite. The World 3 simulation provided the perfect pseudo-scientific alibi to justify top-down control. They weaponized a bad line of code to convince you that your existence is fundamentally a threat to the planet. You are paying the price for this rigged math every time you buy groceries or pay an energy bill. But a theoretical computer glitch is one thing. Making the public believe it is another entirely. For this digital terror to fully infect the global consciousness, the elite needed a miracle. They needed a very real, very physical crisis to make their fake simulation look like the Word of God. I look at the archival footage from 1973, and I see exactly what the elite needed. A physical crisis to legitimize their digital terror. Miles of heavy steel cars are stalled outside American gas stations. Drivers, exhausted and furious, are physically fighting over the last drops of fuel. The desperation is palpable, choking the air just as thickly as the exhaust fumes. Overlay this visceral panic with the cold predictive graphs of the MIT World 3 simulation, and you witness a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. The computer model had promised a catastrophic crash in natural resources. Now, looking at the empty fuel pumps,
The public believed they were watching the code execute in real life. It is the ultimate illusion of the 20th century.
This is the luck of the apocalypse. How does an unrelated geopolitical conflict turn a deeply flawed Malthusian computer program into the undisputed word of God? You have been taught that the 1970s environmental movement was a spontaneous awakening. That is a myth. It was a mass trauma response, hijacked by an algorithm that was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Let us examine the timeline of this statistical heist. In 1972, the Club of Rome publishes their blueprint for global decline. Just 1 year later, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, unleashes a devastating oil embargo. The price of a barrel of oil quadruples practically overnight. The shockwave shatters the global economy. To the terrified politicians and the citizens waiting in line for hours, this did not look like a temporary trade dispute. It looked like the exact, inevitable resource depletion that the MIT supercomputer had mathematically guaranteed. The simulations seemed violently, undeniably accurate. A complete coincidence was instantly repackaged as scientific prophecy. As a forensic observer of macroeconomic history, I can tell you this is where the permanent psychological damage was inflicted. The embargo had absolutely nothing to do with the Earth running out of fossil fuels. The crude oil was still there, sitting beneath the sand and idling in massive tankers off the coast. The scarcity was entirely political, not geological. But the human brain is not wired for geopolitical nuance when the gas gauge hits empty. Drawing on the behavioral economics of Daniel Kahneman, we see the availability heuristic weaponized on a global scale. The public panicked. They looked for an explanation, and the global elite handed them the World 3 model. The lie was swallowed whole. The paradigm of Western civilization violently shifted. For centuries, the foundational belief was that humanity is limitless, capable of engineering its way out of any bottleneck. Overnight, that optimism was assassinated. The new, hard-coded dogma dictated that humanity is merely a virus that has finally reached the glass edges of its planetary petri dish. You must understand the sheer arrogance of this intellectual pivot. The architects of this narrative knew the Earth was not barren, yet they watched the middle class brawl over gasoline and realized they had found the ultimate mechanism for control. Fear is the most efficient currency in existence, and the MIT algorithm was printing it by the billion. Panic is highly infectious, and bureaucracy loves a crisis. Governments worldwide began rapidly establishing entirely new agencies, heavily armed energy departments, and sprawling environmental protection bureaus. Every single one of these institutions was built on the unquestioned assumption of absolute impending scarcity. The math had successfully hacked mass psychology. These were not temporary emergency measures. They were permanent infrastructural shifts designed to manage the decline of human prosperity. The state expanded its reach into the microscopic details of industrial output and civilian consumption. The computer code had escaped the sterile laboratory in Massachusetts and was now drafting federal legislation. Think about the sheer scale of this deception. A mathematical error, the deliberate suppression of human innovation in the simulation's code, was legitimized by a Middle Eastern war. It is the geopolitical equivalent of a patient dying from a gunshot wound and the doctor blaming a genetic algorithm for the sudden loss of blood. This is the red pill you must swallow if you want to understand modern economics. The overarching dread that defines your current reality,
the constant pressure to shrink your footprint and accept less, was not born from scientific observation of nature. It was born from this specific historical accident. The trauma of 1973 was institutionalized. The embargo eventually ended. The oil flowed again, and the cars returned to the highways. But the ideological cage remained locked. The elite had tasted the power of a frightened, self-regulating populace. They realized that if you can convince people the world is ending, they will voluntarily hand over the keys to the economy. The architecture of scarcity was now poured in concrete and defended by armies of regulators. But a system built on a lie is inherently unstable. I knew, looking at the data, that reality was about to clash violently with the simulation. The model stated we would run out of resources, but human genius was about to break the code. I watched the historical commodities data scrolling across my Bloomberg terminal here in Geneva. The numbers from the late 1990s do not lie, and they certainly do not match the apocalyptic prophecies of 1972. The MIT code explicitly stated that the Earth's crust was rapidly emptying, that industrial civilization was running on fumes. But the flashing green tickers on my screen tell a profoundly different story. Humanity did not starve in the dark. Look at the historical footage transitioning on my second monitor. We move from the desperate, rusting oil derricks of the 1970s to the colossal, precision-engineered deep-sea drilling rigs of the 21st century. Oil is practically gushing from the screens. We are supposed to be out of resources by now, living in a scavenged wasteland. Instead, the exact opposite happened. The doomsday equation encountered a variable it fundamentally could not process. You were taught in school that we are constantly on the brink of exhausting our planet. That is a statistical lie, a phantom fear programmed into you by a failed hypothesis. By the dawn of the 21st century, a glaring anomaly emerged that threatened to dismantle the entire Club of Rome narrative. The Earth was not running out of anything. Human innovation, driven by market demand and sheer survival instinct, had vastly outpaced the rigid limits of the World 3 simulation. The engineers did what humans always do. They cheated the mathematical limits. Breakthrough technologies like hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling suddenly unlocked massive, previously inaccessible energy reserves embedded deep within shale rock. The United States went from anticipating a permanent energy famine to becoming a net exporter. We found infinitely more oil and natural gas, not less. The foundational peak oil variable hard-coded into the MIT mainframe was proven entirely false. As a forensic analyst tracking the flow of global capital, I see this as the ultimate software crash. The central pillar of their simulated apocalypse simply collapsed under the weight of human ingenuity. The Club of Rome told the world that the party was over. But here on the trading floor, the energy markets were flooded with newly discovered cheap hydrocarbons. The apocalypse was officially behind schedule, and for the architects of global control, this was a disaster. What happens to a doomsday cult when the world stubbornly refuses to end on the prophesied date? They do not pack up their bags and apologize for the inconvenience. They recalculate the math and move the goalposts. The global elite had spent 3 decades constructing an incredibly lucrative architecture of regulatory control, energy departments, and supranational oversight committees. You do not just dismantle a multi-trillion-dollar bureaucracy because your underlying science was wrong. I am pulling up the archives of global policy summits from the late 1990s. The vocabulary in the briefing documents abruptly changes. The panic over scarcity vanishes overnight. The models are quietly patched, The old predictions of dry oil wells are swept under the rug, and a brand new threat vector is introduced. The elite realized they could not control you by saying the gas tank was empty. They had to convince you that starting the engine was a moral crime.
The narrative mutated with virus-like efficiency. The new threat was no longer that we would run out of abundant energy, but that actually using this magnificent bounty would destroy the global climate. It is a brilliant psychological pivot. If the Earth is providing too many resources, you must artificially manufacture the scarcity yourself. The mechanism of control survives perfectly intact. Only the public justification has to be swapped out for a newer, scarier model. Snap your attention to the live feed from today's climate summit playing on my main display. The private jets are lined up on the tarmac, while inside, politicians debate the precise chemical composition of the atmosphere. They are no longer talking about peak oil or empty copper mines. The entire lexicon has been scrubbed. The enemy shifted from absolute resource scarcity to a single ubiquitous element, carbon. A ubiquitous element produced by nearly every human action. This is where the historical illusion shatters. Look closely at the policy solutions being aggressively pushed at these modern summits. It is the exact same list of demands from 1972. Aggressive taxation, forced rationing of energy, deliberate suppression of industrial output, and centralized economic planning. They merely took the old, draconian solutions intended for the resource crisis and pasted them seamlessly onto the new carbon apocalypse. It is the greatest geopolitical rebranding exercise in modern history. The architecture of decline was preserved, but the marketing department was overhauled. You are being forced to accept lower living standards, massive energy bills, and a shrinking horizon of opportunity, not because the Earth cannot support you, but because the algorithms of control require your submission. They need your footprint to shrink so their regulatory power can expand indefinitely. Through my monitors, I watch trillions of dollars being rerouted based on these new carbon metrics. The original MIT simulation was primitive, but its modern descendants are highly sophisticated financial weapons. They have successfully financialized human guilt. Every time you turn on a light switch, drive to work, or buy groceries, you are generating the very invisible enemy they claim to be fighting. You are no longer just a consumer. You are a biological hazard. The statistical reality is hiding in plain sight. Despite decades of these apocalyptic warnings, the global population lifted out of extreme poverty surged by more than 1 billion people since the 1990s, largely powered by those exact same hydrocarbons. In the United States alone, natural gas production increased by over 60% between 2010 and 2020. The math proves that human prosperity is scaling alongside resource discovery, totally breaking the simulation's constraints. They miscalculated our resilience, and so they had to criminalize it. The global elite cannot allow a world where energy is cheap, abundant, and democratized. That kind of freedom makes centralized authority obsolete. So, the computer code was rewritten. The simulation mutated from a warning about an empty planet into a crusade against a warming one. But the core objective never wavered: to place a hard mathematical limit on human ambition. As I cross-reference the carbon mandates with the original 1972 parameters, a chilling pattern emerges from the data. If carbon is the new ultimate enemy, and human beings are the primary emitters of carbon, the logical conclusion of this patched algorithm is terrifyingly clear. To save the simulated world, the code must eliminate the source of the anomaly. The elite did not just declare war on your energy consumption. They declared war
on your existence.
The elite did not just declare war on your energy consumption. They declared war on your existence. Step inside this stark, minimalist maternity ward with me.
Listen to the profound silence. There are no cries, no frantic nurses, just rows of empty bassinets. You are conditioned to view this as a tragic socio-economic trend, but the official narrative is a carefully constructed myth.
Look closely at the digital hospital monitor at the end of the hall. It displays a steadily declining birth rate graph, a line trending downward toward oblivion. But as you watch, that graph seamlessly morphs into a modern smartphone application, a personal carbon footprint calculator. This is the scene of the perfect crime, where the victim not only volunteers for erasure, but feels morally superior for doing so. We have reached the ultimate paradox of modern environmental anxiety. What happens when the architects of our global policies determine that the most dangerous, toxic pollutant on Earth is a new human life? You've been told that giving up your gas stove or paying a carbon tax will save the world. But those are just the appetizer. The main course is your genetic obsolescence. To understand this psychological hijacking, we must look past the modern green propaganda and return to the root directory of the 1972 MIT simulation. When Jay Forrester and his team fed their data into the World 3 model, they encountered a terrifying feedback loop. The most volatile, destabilizing variable in their entire digital terrarium was not industrial output or agricultural yield. The fatal variable was the population multiplier. The primitive code of the IBM mainframe calculated that human beings were merely consumers of finite resources and generators of pollution. Therefore, the machine insisted on a brutal, inescapable logic. To stabilize the global system and prevent mathematical collapse, human numbers had to dramatically and permanently fall. But you cannot simply tell billions of people to stop reproducing because a computer program in a Massachusetts basement said so. You would spark an immediate, violent revolution. The true genius of the global elite was realizing that you cannot enforce demographic collapse through tyranny. You have to launder the 1972 logic through the pristine filter of modern environmentalism. You have to make the population beg for its own reduction. And that brings us to the modern era, where the old limits to growth algorithm has been perfectly translated into the language of climate justice. Consider a highly publicized, widely cited study published in 2017 by researchers at Lund University in Sweden. It is the holy grail of the new antinatalist movement. This flagship study analyzed various lifestyle choices to determine how individuals could best fight a warming planet. They looked at recycling, upgrading light bulbs, and transitioning to plant-based diets. But their ultimate conclusion was a direct echo of the World 3 mainframe. The single most effective way to reduce your personal carbon footprint, they declared, is having one fewer child. The researchers did not just make a philosophical argument, they quantified the uncreated life. According to their peer-reviewed mathematics, choosing not to bring a new human into the world saves a staggering 58.6 metric tons of carbon equivalent per year. Your unborn child is no longer a denied future. It is a statistical victory on a global ledger of emissions. Do you see the intellectual horror of what they have accomplished? Human reproduction has been entirely stripped of its biological imperative, its cultural significance, and its profound joy. Through the relentless repetition of these statistics, the very act of starting a family has been reframed for the modern citizen as an act of selfish, unforgivable ecological terrorism. You were taught to feel a deep, existential guilt for the mere act of existing, and an even deeper shame for wanting to pass that existence on. This is not a grassroots psychological shift born of empathy for nature. The anxiety driving the collapse of birth rates across the Western world is a meticulously engineered psychological construct designed to make you police your own biology. Every time a young couple decides they cannot afford the carbon guilt of a second child, the ghost in the machine wins. This is not cutting-edge climate science adapting to a changing atmosphere. This is the original 1972 DYNAMO code demanding its ultimate biological sacrifice. The simulation requires less of you, and it has weaponized your own morality to achieve it. We are living inside a mathematical illusion where progress is defined as human subtraction. The elite have successfully convinced an entire generation that their absence is the greatest gift they can offer the universe. It is a stunning victory for the algorithms of depopulation, hiding behind the benevolent mask of environmental stewardship and sustainable development goals. But statistics lie when the base assumptions are flawed, and you have been completely programmed to accept an equation that was rigged from the very beginning. The World 3 model, the Lund University study, and every carbon calculator on your phone all share the exact same catastrophic blind spot. They treat human beings strictly as a negative variable, a plague upon the system. They calculated your consumption, your waste, and your 58.6 metric tons of carbon. But they mathematically ignored the one force in the universe that cannot be programmed, predicted, or contained within a closed digital loop. The entire elite architecture of decline relies on you never realizing the fundamental error in their code. They forgot to calculate the power of the human mind. Look at the glow of the purple LED lights illuminating this vertical farm in the heart of the metropolis. We are standing inside the physical proof that the 1972 simulation was a mathematical lie. Here, crops are cultivated at a density that the Club of Rome deemed physically impossible. The soil is replaced by precision aeroponics, yielding 50 times more food per acre than traditional farming. The model predicted mass starvation. Instead, we engineered an agricultural miracle. Just miles from here, a nuclear fusion reactor prototype sparks into life, briefly containing a plasma hotter than the core of the sun. The architects of World 3 assumed that energy extraction would always remain a zero-sum game of depleting finite fossils. They looked at the Earth as a closed terrarium, a rigid system slowly running out of air. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of resources. A resource is not a physical object. It is a manifestation of human intellect. The fatal axiom of the limits to growth was its absolute failure to quantify human genius. The DYNAMO code processed humans strictly as biological liabilities, counting every birth as merely another mouth to feed, another metric ton of carbon to be burned. It never calculated that a new human being is, first and foremost, a mind capable of infinite invention. You cannot simulate an intellect that has not yet been born, and you cannot mathematically predict a paradigm-shifting breakthrough. Because their model was locked in linear time, the MIT researchers could never foresee the microchip, the architecture of the Internet, or the genomic revolution. They projected 1970s industrial inefficiency a century into the future, assuming we would just build more smokestacks. They failed to realize that true economic growth is not about consuming more matter. It is about arranging matter more intelligently. We learned to manipulate reality at the atomic and digital levels. This is not abstract philosophy. It is an undeniable macroeconomic reality. Over the last 50 years, we have achieved what environmental pessimists swore was impossible: relative decoupling. Gross domestic product across the United States and Europe has grown by hundreds of %, while our total carbon emissions and physical resource consumption have actually fallen. We are generating exponentially more wealth, more data, and more sustenance while using significantly less of the planet. The Case Against Humanity, written 50 years ago on an IBM 360 mainframe, is officially closed, and the verdict is clear. The simulation was not a prophecy. It was a psychological weapon. The modern agenda of forced depopulation and mandated scarcity is merely a ghost in the machine. It is a legacy code of fear, kept alive by an elite class that profits immensely from rationing your existence. They sell you a pre-packaged apocalypse to justify their absolute control over the market. We began this investigation trapped in a matrix of environmental guilt, bombarded by daily headlines demanding our submission to an artificially engineered decline. We traced that anxiety back through the fracking revolution, the 1973 oil crisis, and finally to a smoke-filled room in Italy where the global elite decided there were simply too many of us. We watched them build a mathematical Trojan horse to convince you that your own prosperity was a crime against the earth. But the illusion is finally dispelled. The equation of doom only works if you agree to stop thinking, if you agree to accept their artificial boundaries as your ultimate reality. The entire geopolitical panic over overpopulation and carbon footprints relies entirely on your compliance with their flawed variables. They need you to believe that the human story is a tragedy of overconsumption, rather than an ongoing epic of continuous adaptation and technological triumph. Malthus was wrong in the 18th century, and his digital disciples at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology were wrong in the 20th. There is no hard physical limit to human flourishing, only temporary technological bottlenecks that we eventually shatter. The true scarcity is never found in the Earth's crust or the atmosphere. The only real scarcity is a manufactured deficit of ambition, imposed upon you by a system that finds a fearful, shrinking population much easier to manage. The problématique that the Club of Rome was so terrified of was never actually climate collapse or resource depletion. Their true nightmare was the loss of centralization. A world of infinite energy, vertical agriculture, and limitless human innovation is a world where the old power structures become instantly obsolete. If you do not need their fragile supply chains or their heavily taxed energy grids, then you no longer need their governance. Innovation is the ultimate act of rebellion. This is the ultimate glitch in their matrix. The algorithm assumed you were a static variable, a predictable consumer accepting the managed decline of civilization. But by decoding their history, you have stepped outside their simulation. You now possess the forensic perspective to see through every climate tax, degrowth mandate, and media panic. You understand the boundary of human potential is not a physical wall. It is a psychological cage you can simply leave behind. The limit to growth is entirely psychological. Once you internalize this axiom, the world transforms from a sinking ship into an open frontier. The future does not belong to the elite who want to ration the remaining crumbs of a dying paradigm. It belongs to the builders and free thinkers who understand that human life is the engine of the universe, not its exhaust. We are not the disease. We are the immune system of this planet, finally waking up to our true and boundless capabilities. The architecture of decline is collapsing, but dismantling it entirely requires a continuous, uncompromising investigation. If this forensic analysis has given you a new perspective on the geopolitical forces shaping your life, hit the subscribe button to join the rebellion of human ingenuity. We are building a community of minds that refuse to be simulated. Drop a comment below and declare which artificial limit you are ready to break first. The true curriculum of the future is written by us. The math of the 1970s was rigged to make you surrender. But reality is not bound by the obsolete code of frightened men. You are the ultimate anomaly, the spark of genius that no algorithm can ever contain. The age of managed decline is over. It is time to step out of the terrarium, reclaim your future, and build the world they told you was mathematically impossible. Class dismissed.